June 6, 1944. The sky over Normandy is burning. Flak bursts bloom like black flowers around the wings of 1,000 planes. Among them, one fighter cuts through the chaos. A P-51 Mustang, call sign June Bug. At its controls, Lieutenant Thomas Fraser of the 334th Fighter Squadron. He's been in the air for hours, far beyond the Mustang's safe range. Below him, the beaches are choked with smoke. Above, the air is alive with fire. Tracer rounds slice past his canopy, red and white streaks that flash and vanish in an instant. His mission, to guard the bombers, to hold the sky open for the men storming the beaches. But now, he's alone. The Merlin engine coughs, sputters. The gauges tremble. Oil sprays against the glass. Fraser grips the stick tighter. He knows what's coming. He's losing altitude, and fast. The sky that once promised victory now feels like a trap. He glances down at the ground far below, green fields, tiny roads, enemy lines. There's no help coming. No friendly airfield. Just France and fate. His breath quickens. He mutters to himself, half prayer, half curse. The sky was burning, and the only place left to go was down. Fraser spots an open stretch of farmland near Cambrai. He kills the throttle, trims the nose, and braces himself. The propeller slows to a blur. The Mustang begins to glide, wounded, heavy, silent. Every second stretches long. He can almost hear his heartbeat over the rushing wind. The ground rises up fast. A fence flashes by. A hedgerow tears beneath the belly of the plane. Then, impact. A jolt. A scream of metal. The Mustang skids across the earth, plowing through mud and grass until it groans to a halt. For a moment there is nothing. No gunfire. No engine. Only stillness. Fraser exhales shakily, unbuckles the harness, and shoves the canopy open. The smell of smoke and soil fills his lungs. He slides down the side of the fuselage and collapses into the tall grass. Behind him, the P-51 lies broken but whole, wings bent, nose buried but unmistakable. A fallen predator. Its olive drab paint streaked with dirt, its white star barely visible beneath the grime. He stumbles away one step at a time until he disappears into the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings. The echo fades across the empty fields. The sky that roared with war now hangs in perfect, haunting silence. Hours later, footsteps break the stillness. A German crash recovery team, a Bergungstruppe, moves through the field. They've come following reports of a downed American fighter. The first soldier sees it and freezes. There, half buried in the soil, lies the legend they've heard about. The Mustang. He whistles under his breath. Another murmurs, "Unglaublich, ist fast ganz." Unbelievable, it's almost whole. They circle the wreck like archaeologists around a sacred relic. The engine, silent now, still gleams faintly beneath its shattered cowling. The cockpit glass is cracked but intact. The markings, U.S. Army Air Forces, clear as day. One of them touches the fuselage, running a gloved hand over the cool metal. For a moment, no one speaks. They all know what this means. To them, this is not just a wreck. It's a treasure. A key to the enemy's greatest secret. The aircraft that changed the war in the air. They signal to fetch trucks, cameras, engineers. Soon, the field will be filled with men in gray uniforms, measuring every inch of the captured Mustang. But for now, as the sun dips behind the trees, the fallen fighter lies silent. A perfect machine betrayed by fire and gravity. A symbol of American might, now resting in the hands of its enemies. And somewhere beyond that horizon, the war goes on. By the winter of 1943, the once invincible Luftwaffe was bleeding from the sky. Every month, Allied bombers pushed deeper into Germany, a tide of silver that no longer turned back at the border. For years, the Reich had ruled the air with speed, precision, and fear. But now, the hunters were becoming the hunted. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, once the jewel of Göring's air arm, was showing its age. Its narrow landing gear made takeoffs treacherous. Its range was short, its frame cramped, its climb rate no longer what it used to be. The Focke-Wulf 190 was sturdier, a brute built for low and medium altitudes, but it too was being pushed to its limits. Every mission felt like a race against the fuel gauge. The further they flew, the less they could fight. German pilots still fought with pride, the aces of the Eastern Front, men with scores etched into their tails, but they were drowning in numbers. In 1943 alone, the Allies lost more than 60,000 airmen over Europe. Yet for every bomber that fell, 2 more took its place. The Americans called it round-the-clock bombing. Day by day, wave after wave, the sky itself became a battlefield too wide for the Luftwaffe to defend. Hermann Göring, still clinging to the illusion of control, issued one desperate order after another. He demanded that his fighters meet the bombers head-on. He ordered tighter formations, stricter defense zones, shorter flights. Every theory looked perfect on paper, until the moment the engines started. And once those engines roared to life, reality took over. Fuel shortages, worn-out aircraft, inexperienced replacements. Confidence began to crack, replaced by something far worse: exhaustion. Then, in late 1943, the Americans introduced a new kind of escort fighter. Longer range, higher speed, deadlier precision. It had lines as sleek as a blade, wings like a gull in flight, and a sound that pilots described as a silver howl. They called it the P-51 Mustang. At first, the Germans didn't believe the reports. A single-engine fighter flying all the way from England to Berlin and back? Impossible, they said. No aircraft could escort bombers that far. But then came March 6, 1944. The first daylight raid on Berlin. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses crossed the Rhine, trailed by a swarm of glinting specks high above them. German radar operators called in the sightings. Fighter groups scrambled. At 25,000 feet, the two forces met. What followed wasn't a dogfight, it was a reckoning. The Mustangs dove like arrows, their Packard Merlin engines screaming. They cut through the Luftwaffe formations with terrifying precision. Bf-109s fell like sparks from a dying fire. FW-190s tried to roll away, but the P-51s were faster, lighter, hungrier. When the smoke cleared, Berlin had been bombed, and the bombers had returned. For the first time, the American daylight raids hadn't been massacres. They were victories. That night, Göring stood at his window and watched the sky burn red with the glow of Allied flares. He turned to his aides and said quietly, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." From that day forward, the Germans called it the Silver Ghost. A machine that could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish into the clouds. A symbol of a new kind of war, one that Germany could no longer control. Inside the Luftwaffe's high command, confusion turned to curiosity. What was this plane? How could it fly so far, so fast, with such perfect balance? The engineers at Rechlin, Germany's top-secret test center, began scouring reports, photos, and fragments from wrecks brought in from the front. They needed answers. They needed a Mustang of their own. And so, the machine of intelligence went to work. Every crash site was treated like gold. Recovery teams, the Bergungstruppe, combed the countryside for any scrap of the new fighter. Engines, instruments, even fragments of the propeller were gathered, catalogued, and sent to Rechlin. But the Luftwaffe wanted more than pieces. They wanted a whole aircraft, alive, intact, ready to fly. That mission fell to a special unit known only to a handful of officers. It was called Zirkus Rosarius, Rosarius's Circus. A traveling squadron of captured Allied aircraft, flown by German test pilots, painted with crosses instead of stars. Their job was to understand the enemy by becoming him. At first, they tested Spitfires and Thunderbolts, learning their strengths and flaws. They mocked the British for their soft landings, the Americans for their heavy controls. But when the first whispers of a captured Mustang reached their ears, everything changed. The pilots of Zirkus Rosarius were experts, men who could sense the character of an aircraft in seconds. When they finally stood before the fallen P-51B, stripped of its mud and patched with German markings, a silence settled over the hangar. They knew, even before it flew, that this was something different. The sleek fuselage, the laminar flow wing design, the cockpit, simple, balanced, efficient. It was not just another fighter. It was a statement, a machine built for endurance, dominance, and control of the sky itself. 4 years, the Luftwaffe had fought with pride, trusting in experience, in tactics, in legend. But now, standing before the Mustang, they began to see the truth. They were fighting an enemy not just of courage, but of industry. An enemy that could outbuild, outfly, and outlast them. The engineers at Rechlin recorded every detail, testing the Mustang's performance, comparing it to their own Bf-109s and FW-190s. The results were sobering. The Mustang climbed faster. turned smoother. Held its range for hours longer than any German plane could dream. Confidence turned to confusion. Confusion turned to disbelief. And disbelief, to quiet realization. The sky that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to something else. Something born in America, powered by a British heart, and carried by pilots who refused to turn back. By the spring of 1944, the Silver Ghost ruled the heavens. And every German pilot knew it, from the rookie at the airfield to Göring himself. The twilight of the Luftwaffe had begun. And the dawn of the Mustang was here. They called it Zirkus Rosarius, Rosarius's circus. A strange, secret squadron that seemed almost unreal. Its planes wore black crosses instead of stars or roundels, but their shapes, their wings, their engines, were unmistakably allied. Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and now a Mustang. All of them captured, repaired, and flown by German hands. And at the center of it all stood Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius. Rosarius was not a typical Luftwaffe officer. He had the posture of a soldier, yes, precise, composed, but the mind of a scientist. Before the war, he'd been a flight instructor, fascinated less by victory and more by understanding how machines truly worked. He believed that every aircraft carried the personality of the nation that built it. To him, studying a plane was like reading its soul. When the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch formed a unit to evaluate captured Allied aircraft, there was no question who would lead it. Rosarius was given a handful of trusted test pilots, a team of engineers, and a small fleet of strange foreign birds. They called themselves the circus, because wherever they went, crowds gathered to watch the impossible. German pilots performing in enemy planes. Under Rosarius's command, the group became more than just a technical experiment. It became a mirror, one that forced the Reich to see what it was truly up against. He ran the unit like a classroom, not a barracks. Pilots discussed lift ratios and compression curves the way soldiers might discuss tactics. Each flight was a lesson, each landing a lecture. There were no medals here, no glory. Only data, understanding, and respect for the craft of flying. Rosarius would often stand at the edge of the airstrip at Rechlin, hands behind his back, watching as an Allied fighter, newly painted in German markings, rolled out under the sun. He didn't see enemies in those machines. He saw teachers. Each one revealing what German engineering had overlooked, what the Luftwaffe had refused to change. To his men, he was both mentor and mystery, a man of few words, but with an uncanny sense of what made an airplane alive. He wasn't flying for the Reich's glory anymore. He was flying for truth. Among his most trusted pilots was a man named Hans-Werner Lerche. Lerche was calm, unnervingly calm. He spoke softly, moved deliberately, and never raised his voice, even when engines screamed or landing gear failed. To watch him in the cockpit was to see complete control. Every movement exact, every decision thought through to the last detail. By the time he joined Zirkus Rosarius, Lerche had flown almost every type of aircraft in the Luftwaffe, from the nimble Bf-109 to the heavy Heinkel bombers. But his true calling was testing captured planes. His flight logs would later list nearly 100 foreign aircraft, British, American, Soviet, each one flown, measured, and dissected through experience. He was the kind of pilot who trusted numbers more than instincts. If the report said the stall speed was 78 knots, he would test it at 79. If the engineers warned that a turn past 20 degrees might cause a spin, he would test 21. Not recklessly but precisely, always pushing just far enough to learn, never far enough to die. To Rosarius, Lerche was invaluable, the mind of a mathematician inside the heart of an aviator. And together they became the perfect pair. One led the search for understanding. The other turned that search into flight. Within the walls of Zirkus Rosarius, the atmosphere was unlike anywhere else in the Luftwaffe. There was no shouting, no parade ground discipline. Only concentration, the quiet hum of minds at work. Each morning began the same way. The pilots gathered around a long wooden table littered with blueprints, reports, and coffee cups stained by sleepless nights. They reviewed photographs of wrecks recovered from the front, discussed performance curves, and debated theories of airflow. Then the hangar doors would open and the world outside would fall away. Rows of Allied aircraft gleamed in the filtered sunlight, an impossible sight. A British Spitfire Mk9, its graceful wings still carrying the scars of battle. An American P-47 Thunderbolt, its massive radial engine glinting like a steel drum. A twin-boomed P-38 Lightning, sleek and alien, sitting beside them like a creature from another planet. And now, at the end of the row, the newcomer, the P-51 Mustang. It looked different even when still, balanced, poised, as if it were waiting for permission to take back to the air. The men of the circus walked among the planes with reverence. They touched the metal skins, traced the rivet lines, noted every dent and panel. They treated these machines not as trophies but as puzzles to be solved. When it came time to fly, the airstrip would fall silent. Every takeoff was a risk. One misjudged throttle, one misunderstood switch, and the aircraft could become a coffin. But Lerche never hesitated. He climbed into the cockpit, adjusted the unfamiliar harness, and studied the instruments with surgical focus. His voice crackled over the radio, calm as ever. Engine start, all gauges steady, taking off. The propeller roared to life. The Mustang rolled forward, wheels bumping over uneven ground. Then lift. Effortless. Smooth. Even the Luftwaffe pilots watching from the sidelines couldn't hide their awe. In the air, Lerche described what he felt. The controls are light, he reported. Response immediate. Stability excellent. Turning radius superior to the BF-109. Elevator pressure, perfect. Rosarius listened carefully, jotting notes, each word confirming what he already suspected. This aircraft was a masterpiece. A machine born from function, not ideology. Every part existed for a reason. No ornament, no waste. Just purpose. When Lerche landed, Rosarius walked to the plane and placed his hand on the cooling cowling. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Everyone watching understood. In that moment, pride gave way to something more complicated. Respect. A quiet, uneasy respect for the enemy, for the minds and hands that had built this machine. Days turned into weeks as Zirkus Rosarius studied the Mustang. They tested climb rates, fuel efficiency, turn performance, acceleration at altitude. Every number told the same story: the Allies had surpassed them. The pilots didn't say it aloud, not yet, but they felt it. The sky was changing. The Luftwaffe's dominance was slipping away, not through cowardice but through innovation. Inside the circus, curiosity still burned bright, and professional pride held firm. They were Germans after all, engineers, thinkers, aviators. They would learn. They would adapt. But in the quiet moments after the flights, when the hangar lights dimmed and the engines cooled, an unspoken truth hung in the air. They were no longer the masters of the sky. They were the students now. And their teacher, who wore a star and a stripe on its wing. The Mustang did not arrive at Rechlin in one piece. It came in crates. Bent aluminum, torn flaps, twisted propeller blades, a shattered canopy. What had once been a proud American fighter was now a jigsaw of wreckage, dragged from a field somewhere near Aachen. But to the men of Zirkus Rosarius, this was no corpse. It was a specimen, a patient on the table waiting to breathe again. Inside the hangar, the smell of oil and acetone filled the air. Under white lamps, German mechanics in gray overalls leaned over fragments of a machine none of them had built, none of them truly understood. Every bolt removed was photographed. Every wire traced, labeled, and mapped. They handled it with a strange reverence, half curiosity, half disbelief. The P-51 Mustang was unlike anything they had seen before. Its laminar flow wings, smooth and thin, almost unnatural in shape, were built to cut through air instead of fighting it. No rivets protruded from the surface. Everything was flush, deliberate, engineered with invisible precision. It wasn't beauty for beauty's sake. It was efficiency, discipline, and metal. Then came the heart of the beast, the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. A 12-cylinder V-type machine that purred at idle and howled at altitude. The Germans had built their own masterpieces, the Daimler-Benz 605, the Jumo 213, powerful, brutal engines that demanded obedience. But this engine felt different. It sang instead of shouted. When they disassembled it, they found craftsmanship that bordered on obsession. The tolerances were impossibly tight. The coolant flow, the supercharger design, the spark plug configuration, all harmonized like instruments in a symphony. It wasn't just a machine. It was philosophy made metal. Day after day, the Mustang skeleton began to take shape again. Bent spars were straightened, the fuselage realigned, hydraulics reconnected. New parts were machined by hand where none could be salvaged. Each repair was an act of translation, from English to German, from foreign to familiar. Slowly, the wreck began to resemble an aircraft once more. Rosarius himself oversaw the work, pacing quietly among his men. He never raised his voice, never rushed the process. Precision mattered more than speed. He wanted this plane not just to fly but to tell its secrets, honestly, completely. Weeks passed. The metallic scent of polish replaced the acrid tang of oil. When the final panel was fastened and the last cable tensioned, the mechanic stepped back and stared. The Mustang, the enemy's greatest weapon, stood whole again. Its silver skin gleamed beneath the hangar lights, its lines perfect, its stance proud. Yet something was missing. Not its engine. Not its wings. Its identity. The next step was both practical and symbolic. They would make it German. The painters arrived before dawn. The Mustang was rolled onto an open tarmac, its American stars and bars stripped away with solvent and sandpaper. Where the blue and white insignia once gleamed, dull aluminum now shone through. The sound of brushes, the hiss of compressed air, and bit by bit the transformation began. Over its polished wings, black Balkenkreuz crosses appeared. On its tail the German swastika, bold, unmistakable. Then came the yellow nose, the mark of Zirkus Rosarius, the circus of the Luftwaffe. It was tradition and perhaps a touch of irony. Every plane they tested wore the same bright muzzle, a painter's declaration that said, "We have tamed this one, for now." The final designation was stenciled carefully beneath the cockpit, T9 plus HK. A small code but a powerful statement. From this moment on, the Mustang was no longer a trophy. It was a tool, and soon, a revelation. Still, the mechanics whispered about it in half-jokes, half-fears. Some said the plane looked offended wearing German colors. Others said it seemed to glare at them through its sleek canopy, as if knowing it didn't belong here. Even Lerche, calm as ever, admitted privately that the Mustang had a kind of spirit. Not the arrogance of a German fighter, but the quiet, cold confidence of something born to win. Inside the hangar, Rosarius inspected every line of paint, every instrument on the dashboard. He ran his gloved fingers over the German-language placards now pasted on the controls, a strange blend of two worlds, English craftsmanship labeled in German precision. It was both collaboration and contradiction. The Mustang, reborn, now gleamed under the low winter sun. To anyone standing at a distance, it could have been any other Luftwaffe fighter. But up close you could see the difference, the sleek silhouette, the subtle angles, the foreign grace. It was a ghost in disguise. An intruder dressed in enemy colors. And soon it would fly. The morning of the first test flight was cold. A thin mist clung to the runway, curling around boots and tires. The trees beyond the airfield stood still, no wind, no movement, as if the world itself was holding its breath. At Rechlin, weather dictated everything. Temperature, pressure, humidity, every variable could mean life or death when testing a foreign machine. Rosarius reviewed the data carefully, then nodded once. "Conditions acceptable," he said quietly. Hans-Werner Lerche arrived just before sunrise. He walked the length of the plane without a word, his eyes scanning every inch of the fuselage. It was ritual, his way of learning a plane's language through silence. He touched the nose, checked the propeller's balance by feel, crouched to study the tires. Then he stepped into the cockpit. The canopy closed with a metallic click. For a moment all was still. Then, the low hum of the starter. The propeller jerked once, twice. Then the Merlin engine caught. A deep, throaty growl filled the airfield, unlike any German engine's roar. The sound was smoother, richer, like velvet over thunder. The mechanics exchanged uneasy glances. Even they could tell, this was not one of theirs. Rosarius stood a few meters away, hands clasped behind his back. The yellow-nosed Mustang, his creation, now trembled with restrained power. He felt both pride and dread. What if the machine performed too well? What if it showed them how far they'd fallen behind? Lerche's voice came through the radio, calm and clear. All systems normal. Controls responsive. Taxiing to runway. The plane began to roll. Its tail lifted, nose low, wings slicing the mist like knives through silk. Engines idled, then roared as throttle increased. The air vibrated. The sound of the propeller became a shriek. And then silence. Not real silence, but the kind that follows awe. The kind that comes when everyone realizes they're watching something important. The wheels left the ground. The Mustang, now marked T9 plus HK, climbed effortlessly into the gray German sky. A machine of one nation flying under the flag of another. A contradiction made airborne. Below, Rosarius exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly. His men watched the plane until it became a silver speck against the clouds. And in that moment, as the Merlin's echo faded, they all understood, this was more than a test flight. It was the beginning of revelation. The morning was cold and brittle, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Hans-Werner Lerche sat alone inside the cockpit of the captured Mustang, T9 plus HK, waiting for clearance. Outside, the runway shimmered under a pale German sun. He could feel the vibration of the Merlin through the seat, the rhythm steady and deep, like the heartbeat of something alive. He took a slow breath. The cockpit layout was foreign but not strange. The gauges were English, the levers labeled in words he could not pronounce, yet the logic behind them was clear. Everything was where it should be, clean, balanced, intuitive. Felt American. He eased the throttle forward. The plane began to roll, the wheels humming against the frozen tarmac. Acceleration came smooth, almost lazy, until the supercharger engaged. Then the push came hard, sudden, unstoppable. The tail lifted. The nose rose. And in less than 15 seconds the Mustang was free of the earth. Lerche felt it immediately, the difference. German fighters demanded muscle. They fought the pilot, wrestled him for every maneuver. But this plane felt like silk. The controls moved as if they knew what he wanted before he did. No strain. No resistance. Just perfect obedience. At 1,000 meters he retracted the landing gear. At 2,000 he leveled out. The Merlin purred behind the firewall, its notes steady, hypnotic. He tested the ailerons, crisp. The elevator, smooth. The rudder, precise, without lag or stiffness. Then, climbing again, he opened the throttle. The second stage supercharger kicked in with a subtle whine. He could feel the surge through his spine. The altimeter spun upward, 5,000, 8,000, 12,000 feet. The air thinned, but the Mustang did not care. The Merlin's dual-stage compressor kept breathing for it, forcing life into the engine where German power plants began to choke. At 30,000 feet, Lerche trimmed the plane and glanced at his airspeed indicator. 400. 420. 440 miles per hour. He blinked, checked again. The needle was steady. The Mustang was still climbing. He keyed the radio. Rosarius, this is Lerche. Confirm altitude, 9,000 meters. Speed, 440 miles per hour. Climb rate, still increasing. There was a pause on the other end and then only static. Below, on the ground, engineers stared at their instruments in disbelief. The numbers didn't make sense. No single-engine fighter they'd ever tested had reached those figures, not even close. Not the Bf-109. Not the FW-190. Nothing Germany had could do this. At that moment, above the frozen clouds of Brandenburg, Hans-Werner Lerche realized what the Mustang truly was. Not just a fighter. A phenomenon. He banked left, testing roll response. Instant. No lag, no overcorrection. It moved like it was part of his own nervous system. Then he pulled back, entered a gentle climb, and felt the aircraft's perfect stability. There was no wobble, no trembling. Even at speed, the controls stayed light and alive. It was a plane that wanted to be flown. He whispered to himself, "It does not punish mistakes, it forgives them." The phrase lingered in his headset, half thought, half confession. Because every German aircraft he'd ever flown, the 109, the 190, even the Me-210, demanded discipline through fear. Pushed them too hard and they bit back. But this one, this American machine, seemed built on trust. As he turned toward the sun, the sky flooded with light. The polished wings glowed white, the yellow nose gleamed against the morning haze. In that brilliance, Lerche felt something unexpected, admiration. Not for the enemy but for the craft itself. For the mind that had created such balance, such grace. He brought the Mustang into a shallow dive, testing its acceleration. The speed leapt instantly, 450, 470, 490. He could feel the airflow tighten along the fuselage, the laminar flow working as promised. No buffeting, no violent shake. It cut through the air like a scalpel. Then he pulled up hard. Most German fighters would shudder at that load, the controls stiffen, the wings groan. The Mustang didn't. It simply obeyed, smooth, unwavering, alive. When Lerche finally leveled out, his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from awe. He had flown hundreds of aircraft, Allied and German alike. But nothing Nothing felt like this. He checked the gauges again, watching the fuel consumption barely move. That was the final shock. At this power setting with external tanks, the range could exceed 1,500 miles. Enough to fly from England to Berlin, circle twice, and still return home. He reported the numbers back to Rosarius. The line was silent for a long time before the commander replied, his voice low and measured. Record everything. Every climb, every descent, every vibration. This aircraft changes everything. Below, in the hangar, the technicians gathered around the data as it came in. Each figure was a wound to their pride. Speed, climb, range, in every category the Mustang outperformed their best designs. They tried to find flaws, excuses, altitude calibration, instrument error, wind variation, but the math didn't lie. The numbers hurt. At 30,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 440 miles per hour. The Bf-109G barely managed 390. Its endurance tripled that of a Focke-Wulf. Even the new Me-410s couldn't compete. The Mustang was not just superior. It was the future already airborne. And yet, as Lerche circled above, he felt no triumph, only a strange, quiet respect. It wasn't arrogance that had built this plane. It was clarity. The Americans had not designed it for glory or to impress generals. They had built it to work. To fly farther, fight longer, and bring men home. He banked one last time, turning toward the horizon, the sun burning gold through the canopy. The Merlin hummed steady. The instruments glowed faintly green. Everything was right. Everything made sense. And somewhere deep inside him, Lerche knew, this was how flight was meant to feel. When Lerche brought the Mustang down, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wheels kissed the runway, the propeller still spinning in a perfect blur. The engine idled with the calm purr of something utterly unbothered, a predator that knew it owned the sky. He taxied to the hangar, canopy still fogged from altitude. Mechanics and officers closed in, notebooks ready, faces tight with anticipation. The moment the engine cut, silence fell, a silence that felt almost ceremonial. Then, as the canopy slid open, Lerche pulled off his helmet. He didn't smile. He just looked at Rosarius and said quietly, Herr Hauptmann, this plane flies as if it has no limits. Rosarius stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He had heard stories, of course, British reports, Allied boasts, but hearing it from his own man, from the calmest pilot in the Luftwaffe, carried weight. He gestured for Lerche to continue. It climbs like a dream. It turns smoother than any Messerschmitt. It feels balanced, like every movement is already anticipated. I never fight the controls, they flow. And the engine? He paused as if reluctant to finish the thought. The engine never stops giving. The mechanics exchanged glances. They knew that tone. It was not excitement. It was respect. The test data confirmed every word. Even in rough German translation, the numbers told a story of humiliation disguised as revelation. The Mustang's control harmony was extraordinary, a perfect equilibrium between ailerons, rudder, and elevator. At high speeds the aircraft remained steady. At low speeds it remained forgiving. Where German fighters demanded precision to survive, the Mustang offered mercy. It was, as Lerche would later write, an aircraft that did not punish mistakes, it forgave them. That line would circulate through the corridors of Rechlin like a ghostly admission. Because deep down they knew what it meant. Forgiveness was the luxury of abundance. Of industry. Of a nation that could afford to make perfection repeatable. In the days that followed, the Mustang became their obsession. Rosarius ordered the aircraft disassembled again, this time not for repair, but for understanding. Panels were removed. Measurements taken. The laminar flow wing, with its seamless curvature and hidden rivets, drew particular fascination. German engineers had studied aerodynamic efficiency for years, but here it was, executed with mathematical grace and industrial ease. The realization cut deep. This wasn't a triumph of art. It was a triumph of process. Every piece of the Mustang was built for mass production, standardized, efficient, interchangeable. Where a German factory might hand-fit each part, the Americans stamped thousands, confident they would fit the same way every time. Each rivet, each cable, each valve spoke the language of assembly lines. It wasn't elegant. It was inevitable. Rosarius examined the Packard Merlin, the American-built version of the Rolls-Royce design. He noted the clean casting of its blocks, the uniformity of its parts, the precision of its machining. Where German engines were hand-tuned like violins, this one was engineered like a symphony that could be played by anyone, anywhere, anytime. 1,000 identical hearts, each beating to the same rhythm. He realized then that this was the true secret of the Mustang. Not its shape, not its wings, but its philosophy. Germany built for mastery. America built for continuity. The Reich's engineers crafted brilliance one aircraft at a time, with artisans and precision hands. The United States built systems, factories that produced perfection by the tens of thousands. It was not about the pilot who could push the machine to its edge. It was about ensuring every pilot had a machine that never failed him. When Rosarius wrote his first report on T9 plus HK, his words were measured but heavy. He described the Mustang's extraordinary controllability, its remarkable endurance, and its superb energy retention at altitude. But between the technical lines a quieter message emerged, one that spoke not of engineering but of inevitability. The American fighter, he noted, demonstrates a balance of simplicity and reliability that reflects industrial advantage rather than design superiority. It is not a masterpiece. It is a product of endless supply. That sentence carried both admiration and despair. Because to men like Rosarius, who had dedicated their lives to the craft of flight, the Mustang was both beautiful and horrifying. It proved that genius could be standardized, that excellence could be mass-produced, and that no matter how skilled their pilots were or how precise their engineers, they were now fighting an enemy that could build 100 masterpieces in the time it took them to build one. One afternoon Lerche flew the Mustang again, this time with Rosarius watching from the ground. The plane rose smooth as silk, carving through a sky streaked with thin white contrails. The sound of the Merlin filled the air, not a roar but a deep, confident hum. When it looped overhead, sunlight caught its wings and for an instant, it was impossible to tell whose side it was on. Rosarius removed his cap and watched in silence. He felt pride in the flight, the precision, the control, but the pride wasn't his. It belonged to the machine, to the engineers who had created it across the sea, to the factories that never slept. When Lerche landed, Rosarius met him at the taxiway. He looked up at the yellow nose, the black crosses on silver wings and spoke softly almost to himself. If this is how they build, then we cannot win. Lerche said nothing. He didn't have to. They both knew that wars are not lost in a single battle. They are lost in the factories, in the foundries, in the quiet triumph of design over desire. That night, Rosarius wrote his final line in the Rechlin report. The Mustang represents not merely an aircraft, but a nation's idea of flight. It is the embodiment of function without vanity, precision without fragility. It is the machine that turns skill into certainty. He put down his pen, extinguished his lamp, and sat for a long while in the dark. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, a restless, hollow sound that felt like the breath of something unstoppable. The next morning, the Mustang was rolled back into the hangar. Its engine was covered, its wings polished once more. But among the men of Rechlin, something had changed. The awe had cooled into silence. The curiosity had turned into respect. And deep beneath that respect lay quiet defeat. The Mustang had flown in German skies, and in doing so, it had revealed a truth larger than flight itself, that the future belonged not to those who crafted wonders, but to those who could repeat them. The orders came quietly on a cold morning in late 1944. Zirkus Rosarius, the Luftwaffe's secret test unit, was to take its show on the road. The captured aircraft, once confined to Rechlin's isolated hangars, would now tour the airfields of the Reich. Its mission, to educate the frontline pilots, and perhaps unknowingly to show them the face of their own defeat. They called it taking the show on the road. An innocent phrase, almost playful, but what it truly meant was something heavier. For the first time, ordinary Luftwaffe pilots would see, with their own eyes, the machines that were tearing their world apart. The first stop was Akmer Airfield, near Osnabrück. A cold wind cut across the tarmac as mechanics rolled out a strange silver shape with black crosses freshly painted on its wings. To the young pilots gathered nearby, it looked like something from another world. Sleek, long-legged, its spinner painted bright yellow, its name barely visible beneath the exhaust stains. T9 plus HK. Lerche climbed into the cockpit, his expression as calm as ever. Rosarius gave a brief nod. Engines started, a throaty roar that seemed to vibrate through every rib of the hangar. The Packard Merlin came to life, smoother and deeper than the harsh growl of a Daimler-Benz. It didn't snarl, it sang. The Mustang rolled forward, tail lifting, then launched down the runway like a shot arrow. The crowd of German pilots turned their faces upward as it climbed almost vertically, shrinking into the mist above. Moments later, it dove back down in a perfect arc, crossing low over the airfield, the sound chasing after it like thunder. Gasps and scattered whistles rippled through the group. One young lieutenant whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief, "It doesn't lose speed. It just keeps going." Rosarius watched from the edge of the runway, clipboard in hand, eyes hidden behind dark lenses. He didn't smile. He knew what was coming next, the real show. They called it the mock dogfights. A demonstration, they said, a teaching tool. In truth, it was a slow, methodical breaking of illusions. For this, Lerche took the Mustang to altitude, while a veteran Luftwaffe ace, flying a Bf-109G, climbed to meet him. The two aircraft circled, silver against blue, predator against predator. At first it looked even, two masters at play. But then as the turns tightened, the difference revealed itself. The Mustang bled less speed in the climb. Its engine didn't choke above 25,000 feet. Its laminar flow wings sliced through the air, conserving energy where the 109 fought gravity itself. Each time the German pilot tried to gain the upper hand, the Mustang simply outlasted him, not by power but by endurance. Down below, the observers watched through binoculars, silence stretching between them. Every maneuver told the same story. The Mustang could do everything the 109 could, only longer, smoother, and with less effort. Then came the FW-190, Germany's pride, its heavy-hitting radial engine warrior. A plane that had once terrified Allied pilots. The mock duel began with confidence. The 190 diving, guns simulated, tracer lines imagined. But within minutes, the Mustang climbed past it, turned tighter, rolled out smoother. It could choose when to fight, and when to leave. In aerial combat, that was everything. When the planes landed, no one clapped. There was no laughter, no chatter. Just the sound of engines cooling and boots scuffing across the tarmac. Lerche climbed down, sweat-darkened flight suit clinging to his shoulders. The 190 pilot walked toward him, helmet still in hand, his eyes fixed on the foreign machine. "It's not just faster," he muttered. "It's easier." Lerche nodded once. That was all there was to say. Over the next weeks, Zirkus Rosarius moved from base to base, Fassberg, Langenhagen, Lechfeld. Everywhere they went, crowds gathered. Pilots, mechanics, even officers stood in silence as the Mustang took to the sky. Its sleek shape, its relentless climb, its impossible speed, all of it chipped away at the myth of German air superiority. The shows were meant to teach tactics, to help Luftwaffe squadrons recognize their enemies, to learn their weaknesses. But instead they did something else, they taught doubt. Reports began to trickle in from the front. Pilots were flying higher, staying closer to home, avoiding long chases with the Americans. Some even requested transfers to ground units. They had seen the future of air combat, and they knew they weren't part of it. By late 1944, Luftwaffe morale was collapsing faster than the Reich's borders. For every German fighter lost, 3 Allied Mustangs replaced it in the sky. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, endless fatigue, they were fighting ghosts with empty tanks. Rosarius saw it in their eyes, the veterans who had once joked and bragged in the mess halls. Now they sat quietly, staring into their coffee, the distant rumble of engines above a constant reminder. When the next air raid alarm sounded, few looked up. They didn't need to. They already knew who owned the sky. One evening, after another long day of demonstrations, Rosarius found Lerche sitting beside T9 plus HK. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the silver fuselage. For a moment, it almost looked peaceful, as if the war didn't exist. Rosarius spoke softly. "Do you think they understand what they're seeing?" Lerche took a long breath. "They understand," he said. "They just don't want to." He looked at the aircraft, its skin still warm, the metal humming faintly in the twilight. "This plane," he continued, "it doesn't just fly better. It thinks ahead of you. It makes war feel pointless." Rosarius didn't answer. He didn't need to. In that quiet moment, as night fell over the airfield, both men knew they had witnessed the exact point where the Luftwaffe spirit broke, not in battle but in revelation. By winter's end, the Zirkus continued its tour, though fewer came to watch. The war was turning inward. There were no longer enough planes, fuel, or hope to fill the hangars. Yet the Mustang kept flying, a sleek symbol of what the enemy had become: efficient, unstoppable, inevitable. The circus had gone public. And what it revealed was not entertainment, but the truth. That the Luftwaffe, once the master of the skies, had become the audience, watching helplessly as someone else performed the final act. The Rechlin reports traveled quietly through the Luftwaffe's corridors of power. Technical evaluations, meticulously typed and annotated, moved from the test pilots to Hauptmann Rosarius, and from him to the offices of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium. For the men in command, the words on the pages carried a weight heavier than any bomb dropped over Berlin. Numbers, once abstract, were now terrifyingly concrete. Speed, climb, range, handling, all spelled the same verdict. The P-51 Mustang was in a class of its own. It could climb higher, accelerate faster, and endure longer than the fighters Germany had counted on for the defense of the Reich. Every memo was accompanied by annotations in pencil, notes from pilots who had felt the controls in their hands, who had pushed the machine to its limits. The data didn't lie. At headquarters, officers squinted at diagrams, flight envelopes, and comparative tables. The Luftwaffe's doctrine, once built on confidence and tradition, now seemed dangerously fragile. They experimented with tactics to exploit what little vulnerability the Mustang had. They tried forcing it into low-altitude combat where the FW-190 excelled. They studied its liquid-cooled engine, hoping that a precise strike could bring it down. They calculated ways to trap it, to deny it the long-range advantage that had become its signature. Yet every theory faltered. Fuel shortages crippled long missions. Experienced pilots were fewer with every passing week. The Mustang could always choose its fight, and more often than not, it chose victory. Even so, the reports included a human element that was harder to reconcile. Luftwaffe test pilots, men of immense pride and skill, wrote with quiet honesty about what they had flown. They described acceleration that left the 109 struggling, control surfaces that obeyed without punishment, and a cockpit that gave situational awareness they had never dreamed possible. One line, simple in its phrasing, carried more impact than any numerical chart. "You have built a fighter that fights the way we used to fight. We cannot rest anymore." It was not anger or bitterness, but a resigned admiration. These were men trained to dominate the skies, to defend their homeland with unmatched skill, now forced to acknowledge that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The Mustang, in its silver perfection, had changed the calculus of aerial combat forever. The intelligence memos traveled further. Reichsmarschall Göring, long accustomed to triumphs of propaganda over reality, now confronted the quiet authority of facts. Reports from Zirkus Rosarius and frontline units painted a grim picture. Allied bombers escorted by Mustangs could strike German cities with unprecedented freedom. Every German fighter that engaged faced an enemy who could dictate every encounter, who could vanish from combat at will. The air, once a domain of German mastery, had become contested territory under a new rule, the rule of American industry and ingenuity. At the tactical level, attempts were made to exploit what weaknesses remained. The Mustang's radiator and liquid-cooled engine were indeed vulnerable to concentrated fire. A precise hit could cause overheating, loss of pressure, or catastrophic engine failure. German aces trained their pilots to bait Mustangs into lower altitudes where the Bf-109 or FW-190 could excel. They tried ambushes, energy traps, coordinated attacks, all in vain. The combination of Mustang range, speed, and pilot discretion made these tactics largely symbolic. The human response, however, was as striking as the technical reality. POWs and interrogations later recorded the candid reflections of Luftwaffe veterans. Their voices, measured and weary, conveyed respect tinged with despair. They admitted the truth they could not escape. The Mustang was the ultimate expression of what a fighter could be. Even the men who had once called themselves Knights of the Sky now acknowledged an uncomfortable fact. They were facing an adversary who had not only matched their skill but surpassed the very machines they had trusted to define it. One pilot, speaking to American officers in 1945, summarized the revelation with stark simplicity: "You built a fighter that fights the way we used to fight. We cannot rest anymore." It was a confession, a testament, and a quiet eulogy for the Luftwaffe's own pride. The data was precise, but the emotional weight was undeniable. These reports were more than numbers. They were a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truth that Germany's air power was no longer dominant. The Mustang had arrived, and with it, the old rules of aerial supremacy were obsolete. Yet in that quiet surrender, there was something almost noble. Even as they faced technical defeat, the German pilots maintained their discipline and professional integrity. They wrote honestly, measured risks meticulously, and never exaggerated the Mustang's capabilities. The respect they offered the aircraft was unvarnished, untainted by propaganda, and in a way, it immortalized the Mustang in their own history. For the Allies, the significance of these admissions would become clear only in hindsight. It was not just the victories in the sky, nor the numbers of aircraft downed. It was the realization that the enemy themselves had testified to the machine's brilliance, that their own most skilled aviators had flown it, studied it, and acknowledged its superiority without hesitation. The P-51 Mustang was more than a tool of war. It was a symbol of the industrial might, ingenuity, and relentless pursuit of perfection that defined the American approach to conflict. By the end of 1944, the impact was evident not only in reports and memos but in the daily conduct of German pilots. Frontline engagements became increasingly cautious, defensive, reactive. Missions that had once been bold were now calculated to preserve life, to avoid confrontation. The skies over Germany were no longer a proving ground for skill alone. They were a proving ground for engineering, endurance, and strategic foresight. The Mustang in its quiet efficiency had rewritten the rules. And so, the knowledge gained from the captured P-51 was double-edged. It provided technical clarity, yes, but also a psychological blow. The Luftwaffe had the data, understood the enemy, yet could do little to reverse the tide. Respect and resignation became intertwined, an emotional surrender written not in defeat on the battlefield, but in the sober lines of a report. In the silence that followed, one truth remained undeniable: the Mustang was the measure of all things in the air. Every German ace who climbed into its cockpit would carry that knowledge for the rest of the war, a knowledge that acknowledged brilliance, mourned the past, and accepted the immutable fact that some battles are won long before the first shot is fired. The captured P-51 Mustang had spoken. Its verdict was clear. And it was irrevocable. By the winter of 1944, the Zirkus Rosarius was no longer the quiet, controlled experiment it had once been. The skies over Germany were scarred by constant Allied air raids, and the once pristine hangars at Rechlin were vulnerable to bombs, fire, and chaos. Captured aircraft, once treasures of intelligence and symbols of technical curiosity, became liabilities. Pilots and ground crews alike watched as the careful work of months, the meticulous repairs and modifications, was destroyed in a matter of hours. Some planes were deliberately dismantled to prevent recapture, others lost to the relentless pressure of a crumbling front. The Mustang T9 Plus HK, the silver ghost that had haunted German skies and inspired both fear and awe, was among these casualties. Yet the story of these machines did not end with fire and metal. Reports, test data, and pilot notes survived, hidden in filing cabinets, tucked into folders, or smuggled out as the Luftwaffe dissolved. When Allied forces occupied Rechlin and other former Luftwaffe test centers in 1945, they uncovered a trove of intelligence that was as enlightening as it was astonishing. Here were the evaluations of the very aircraft that had dominated the European skies, written not in boasting, but in precise, almost reverent language. German pilots, men who had once been the masters of the air, had documented every performance figure, every nuance of handling, and every advantage the Mustang had possessed. Their words were clear, unemotional, and yet carried a weight of reluctant admiration. For the Americans reviewing these reports, the reaction was twofold. There was pride, of course, in seeing the capabilities of their machines recognized by the enemy, but there was also a profound sense of validation, a historical confirmation that the Mustang had indeed been decisive in the skies over Europe. The numbers, the first-hand observations, the careful comparisons with Bf-109s and Fw-190s, it was all there. The Luftwaffe had borne witness to what many had suspected but few could truly quantify. The P-51 was a game-changer, a machine that had altered the course of the air war and perhaps the war itself. Beyond the data and technical analyses, there was another, more human legacy. The Mustang had become a shared language of flight. Pilots on both sides, separated by nationality and ideology, understood what it meant to climb into its cockpit, to feel its acceleration, to respond to its controls. Even decades later, American and German test pilots could sit across a table and discuss energy tactics, laminar flow wings, and engine response, each speaking a dialect forged in the sky. In these exchanges, respect was implicit. Skill and ingenuity transcended national boundaries. Admiration was universal. The Mustang was not merely a fighter aircraft. It had become a symbol of what disciplined engineering, careful design, and human courage could achieve together. And so, the legacy of the captured P-51s was layered. There was the tactical legacy. A plane that had allowed bomber streams to strike deep into Germany with unprecedented escort protection. There was the technical legacy. Design innovations that would influence post-war aviation for decades to come. And there was the human legacy. Pilots forced to confront the limits of their own skill, to witness the excellence of the enemy, and to record their observations with honesty and integrity. History remembers wars by their battles, their victories, and their losses. But sometimes, history remembers more subtle moments, quiet, analytical, and unflinching. The captured Mustang taught the Germans and later the world about the reach of American industrial power and the thoughtfulness behind its engineering. It reminded all pilots, regardless of uniform, that the sky is ultimately a domain of mastery, courage, and respect. As the final months of the war fell into chaos, the machines themselves may have disappeared. Hangars burned, airfields were overrun, and pilots were scattered. But the spirit of the Mustang endured, immortalized not just in the numbers and graphs left behind, but in the memories of those who flew it and those who dared to test it. Its story is a testament to the quiet power of truth in data, and the way knowledge can forge mutual respect even among former enemies. In the end, the P-51 Mustang, once feared and now revered, stood as a symbol not merely of American victory, but of a universal understanding, that excellence in flight transcends borders, ideology, and time. Even amidst the wreckage of war, that truth remains untarnished, a legacy of courage, engineering, and the shared language of the sky. In the quiet aftermath of war, the P-51 Mustang stood as more than just a fighter aircraft. It became a messenger, carrying a truth that transcended propaganda, ideology, and national pride. The enemy who had once fought relentlessly against it, who had tested it in secret and documented its every capability, had unwittingly confirmed the excellence of American design. Victory, in this case, was silent and methodical, measured not just in the destruction of enemy planes, but in the professional respect of those who had once flown against it. Statistics bore out the legend. Escort missions deep into German territory succeeded at unprecedented rates. Bomber losses dropped dramatically once Mustangs took the sky, and the European air war shifted from uncertainty to near certainty for the Allies. The P-51 was more than a tool of war. It was proof that ingenuity, perseverance, and collaboration could tip the balance in ways that raw numbers alone could not capture. And yet, beyond the numbers and reports, there was the human story. The Mustang represented the melding of American industrial might with meticulous engineering, a collaboration across continents. The Packard-built Merlin engines, adapted from British designs, spoke to a unity of intellect and resourcefulness that fueled not just machines but victory itself. It was a tribute to thousands of men and women in factories, in design bureaus, and in flight schools who had dedicated themselves to excellence, often unseen, often uncelebrated, but always essential. Even as Europe lay in ruins and new powers rose from the ashes, the Mustang remained a testament to what could be achieved when innovation, courage, and discipline converged. The aircraft's silver wings told a story of triumph not just over enemy aircraft, but over limitations, over doubt, and over the chaos of war itself. In that story, the voice of the enemy served as an unexpected echo, one that validated the craft, the strategy, and the human spirit behind the machine. The Mustang had spoken. Its message was clear, unwavering, and enduring. Mastery is measured not by who claims victory, but by the respect earned, even from those who once opposed you. Long after the last shots were fired and the smoke of war had lifted, the captured P-51s left an indelible mark on those who had flown them, studied them, and admired them from afar. For German pilots, climbing into the Mustang was a lesson in humility, a reminder that no skill, no history of victories, could substitute for excellence in design and execution. For American pilots, it was a confirmation that the aircraft they trusted, the machines they had flown into battle, truly represented the cutting edge of what human ingenuity could achieve. The Mustang became a symbol of mastery. It was proof that courage and intellect, combined with industrial precision, could create something that transcended its immediate purpose. It was a tool, yes, but also a teacher, of discipline, foresight, and the importance of respecting one's adversary. Across battlefields and airfields, the Mustang spoke a universal language of flight, performance, and professional pride. Today, the surviving Mustangs, gleaming in museums or thundering at air shows, carry the echoes of those lessons. Veterans recount the thrill of taking the controls, historians study the legacy of its design, and pilots young and old marvel at its elegance and capability. Each silver wing reflects a story of courage, innovation, and relentless pursuit of excellence. In the end, the captured P-51s remind us that the true measure of a machine is not only in the victories it secures, but in the respect it commands. The Silver Ghost, as it was once called in hushed tones by those who faced it, lives on as a testament to the intersection of human spirit, industrial might, and the quiet power of truth. Even in the skies of peace, it whispers its legacy, of courage, ingenuity, and a future shaped by those who dared to reach higher, fly faster, and build better. The Mustang's story is a bridge between nations, a symbol of what is possible when skill, vision, and integrity unite. And in that story, the echo of every flight remains timeless, silver, and true.